Welcome to the Blood Moon channel. Before we start, don't forget to like and comment where you're listening to us from today. Keep your doors and windows closed. You don't want to be surprised, do you? Let's get started. Story 1. I've always been fascinated by urban exploration. The thrill of stepping into places where time has stopped, where the walls tell stories, drew me in like a moth to a flame. On this particular day, I had my sights set on an abandoned hospital on the outskirts of town. It was a decaying structure, its once white walls now a sickly shade of grey. Vines snaked up its facade, clawing at broken windows like the skeletal hands of forgotten patients. The air around the hospital was thick with neglect, a heavy sense of unease settling over me as I approached. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what lay ahead. My flashlight flickered to life, casting a narrow beam into the darkness. The echoes of my footsteps followed me as I stepped through the broken doorway and into the hospital's dimly lit corridors. The first few rooms were empty, save for the occasional rusted gurney or shattered piece of equipment. The graffiti on the walls hinted at the hospital's sordid history, with cryptic messages and crude drawings adding to the unsettling atmosphere. I moved deeper into the building, my curiosity pushing me forward despite the growing sense of dread. I turned a corner and found myself in a long hallway. The flickering light revealed doors on either side, most of them ajar. I peeked into each room, finding only debris and decay. But as I reached the end of the hallway, I noticed one door that was tightly shut. The handle was rusty, but I managed to turn it with a bit of effort. Inside, I was met with a peculiar sight. The room was filled with old handwritten patient files, neatly stacked on a table in the center. A single window covered in grime allowed a faint sliver of light to filter in, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I picked up a file and flipped through it, my eyes scanning the yellowed pages. The information was mundane at first: patient names, dates of admission, medical histories. But then I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat: the photos. Each file contained a photo of a patient, and beneath each photo was a note about their disappearance. The dates on the files were from decades ago, yet the patients had vanished without a trace. My breath caught in my throat as I realized that the last file's date was just a few weeks before my visit. I felt a shiver run down my spine, a cold sensation that settled deep in my bones. I rummaged through the other files, finding more photos, plow, and more notes about disappearances. Some patients were elderly, others were children, but they all shared the same fate. No explanations, no clues, just empty spaces where they should have been. My heart raced as I glanced around the room, wondering if I was alone. A noise behind me made me jump. It was faint, like the creak of a floorboard, but it was enough to send me into a panic. I spun around, flashlight sweeping the room, but there was nothing there. My hands shook as I gathered a few of the files, shoving them into my backpack. I needed to get out of there fast. I retraced my steps, my pace quickening with each turn. The hospital's layout seemed different on the way back, as if the walls had shifted in my absence. I took a wrong turn and found myself in a dead-end corridor The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to lengthen, reaching for me like dark fingers. A door at the end of the corridor creaked open, and I froze. A figure stepped out, shrouded in darkness. I couldn't see their face, but I could feel their gaze cold and unblinking. I backed away slowly, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The figure didn't move, but I could hear their breathing, slow, deliberate, almost rhythmic. I took a deep breath and sprinted back the way I came, my heart pounding in my chest. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, my footsteps echoing like a drumbeat. I burst through the broken doorway and into the daylight, gasping for air as I stumbled onto the overgrown path leading away from the hospital. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, my backpack heavy with the files I had taken. As I sat in the driver's seat, I glanced back at the hospital, its decaying silhouette looming over the landscape. I knew I would never return to that place, not after what I had seen. But the files in my backpack, the photos of the vanished patients, would haunt me for the rest of my life. The mystery of their disappearances and the figure in the dark would be with me forever. The trail through the forest was my escape from the noise of city life. It was my sanctuary, a place where I could lose myself among the towering trees and the whispers of the wind. On this particular day, I had ventured deeper into the wilderness than I ever had before, pushing past the usual hiking routes into the untouched heart of the forest. The further I went, the more isolated I felt. The trail narrowed, becoming little more than a thin ribbon of dirt snaking through the underbrush. The bird song that had accompanied me earlier faded, replaced by an eerie silence. I relished the solitude, the sense of being truly alone in nature. But as the shadows grew longer, a creeping unease settled over me. I continued hiking, keeping an eye on my compass to ensure I didn't stray too far off course. The trees grew thicker, their branches weaving together to form a dense canopy overhead. Sunlight filtered through in sporadic bursts, casting shifting patterns on the forest floor. It was beautiful, but there was something about the stillness that set me on edge. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I noticed something out of place, a splash of red against the muted greens and browns of the forest. I approached cautiously, my heart racing as I drew closer. It was a backpack, its once bright fabric now stained with dark, dried blood. My instincts told me to turn back, to leave whatever horrors lay ahead undiscovered. But curiosity overpowered fear, and I reached down to inspect the bag. The bloodied backpack was heavy, its contents shifting as I picked it up. I unzipped the main compartment and found fresh food inside: sandwiches, fruit, and a bottle of water. The food was still cold, as if it had been packed that morning. I checked the other pockets, finding a map and a small flashlight. But there were no signs of identification, nothing to tell me who this bag belonged to. The lack of footprints or signs of human presence made the situation even stranger. The trail had been pristine, untouched by any recent hikers. I looked around, expecting to see someone emerging from the trees, but there was no one. The forest was silent, save for the distant rustling of leaves in the wind. A chill ran down my spine. It didn't make sense. How could someone be out here with fresh food, and leave without a trace. I stood there for a moment, the backpack in my hands, feeling the weight of the unknown pressing down on me. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to put as much distance between myself and the forest as possible. But something else, a morbid curiosity, kept me rooted to the spot. I decided to follow the trail a bit further, hoping to find some sign of the backpack's owner. As I walked, the forest grew darker, the trees seeming to close in around me. I kept my eyes peeled for any signs of movement, but the only thing I saw were the shifting shadows among the trees. The trail eventually led me to a small clearing. In the center, I saw a crude campsite, a makeshift tent made from a tarp, a smoldering fire pit, and a few scattered items. But there were no signs of life. The air around the campsite was heavy with the scent of smoke, but the fire had long since died out. I searched the area, finding a discarded jacket and a pair of hiking boots, but no people. The bloodied backpack grew heavier in my hands. I felt a wave of nausea as I realized that something terrible had happened here. The absence of people, the bloody bag, and the fresh food had all pointed to something sinister. I backed away slowly, my pulse quickening with each step. I knew I needed to leave, to get as far away from this place as possible. But as I turned to go, I heard a sound, a low guttural growl coming from the trees. It was faint, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. The growl grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was making the sound was closing in on me. I broke into a run, the backpack bouncing against my back as I sprinted down the trail. The forest blurred around me, the branches whipping past my face. As I fled, the growl followed me, growing louder with each step. I didn't stop running until I reached the trailhead. My legs trembling with exhaustion, I dropped the bloodied backpack and stumbled into my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. As I sped away from the forest, the growl faded into the distance, but the memory of the bloodied backpack and the campsite haunted me. I never returned to that forest, not after what I had experienced, the unanswered questions, the chilling growl, Bend, the bloodied backpack. It was a story I would never forget, a reminder that the wilderness could hide dark and terrifying secrets. Story 3, working late at the office, had become a habit of mine. The quiet hours after everyone had left were peaceful, a chance to focus without the constant interruptions of the day. My office was on the top floor, and as the last one in the building, I often felt like I had the entire place to myself. It was just me, the hum of the fluorescent lights, and the rhythmic clicking of my keyboard. That night, I was finishing up a report that was due the next morning. The clock on my desk blinked, 11 for 3 p.m., the numbers casting a faint glow across my paperwork. I stretched, feeling the stiffness in my shoulders from hours of sitting, and decided to grab a coffee from the break room. As I walked down the dimly lit hallway, I noticed the eerie quiet. Usually, I could hear the distant hum of the building's HVAC system, or the occasional creak of the floorboards, but tonight it was as if the entire office was holding its breath. I reached the break room, the smell of stale coffee greeting me. As I flicked on the light, The pot was empty, so I filled it with water and started a new brew. As I waited for the coffee to finish, I heard the sound of the elevator doors opening down the hallway. It was a soft, mechanical whir, followed by the gentle ding of the elevator arriving. I frowned, wondering who else could be in the building at this hour. I peered down the hallway, expecting to see someone step out of the elevator. But there was no one there. The doors were wide open, the empty elevator car sitting silently in the shaft. A chill ran down my spine as I walked toward the elevator, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. I reached out to press the button to close the doors, but they slid shut on their own, the mechanical worry filling the silence. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just a glitch in the system. Elevators could be temperamental, and maybe it was just a random malfunction. I turned to head back to my office, but as I did, I noticed a light flickering at the end of the hallway. It was my boss's office, the light casting a faint glow through the frosted glass door. I knew I was the last one in the building, and my boss had left hours ago. Why was his office light on? I felt a surge of unease as I approached the door. The office was locked, as it always was when my boss wasn't there. I tried the handle, and it didn't budge. The light continued to flicker, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I knocked on the door, hoping for a response, but there was only silence. My heart raced as I peered through the frosted glass, trying to make out any shapes or movement inside. It was hard to see clearly, but I could make out a faint outline, like someone was sitting at the door desk. I knocked again, louder this time, but there was still no answer. I took a step back, my mind racing with possibilities. Had my boss come back to the office without me noticing? It was someone else in there, perhaps a burglar or an intruder. I decided to call security, but when I pulled out my phone, I had no signal. The office was in a tall building, and sometimes the reception could be spotty, but this felt like more than a coincidence. I took a deep breath and decided to go back to my office to use the landline. As I turned to leave, I heard a faint whisper from behind the door. It was soft, almost inaudible, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I froze, straining to hear the words, but it was just a jumble of sounds, like a distant conversation. I didn't know what to do. My instincts told me to leave, to get out of the building and call for help from outside. But curiosity got the better with me, and I returned to my office to grab the spare key to my boss's door. I rummaged through my desk drawer, my hands trembling as I searched for the key. As I found it and turned to leave, I heard the elevator doors open again. The soft ding echoed through the hallway, and I knew I had to act quickly. I ran back to my boss's office, the key in hand, and unlocked the door. The light was still on, but the office was empty. The chair behind the desk was turned as if someone had just left. Papers were scattered across the floor, and a coffee mug was overturned on the desk. The whispering grew louder, like it was coming from all around me. I felt a surge of panic as I backed out of the office, my eyes darting around the empty hallway. The elevator doors were still open, but the car was empty. I knew I had to leave, but something was holding me back, a sense that I needed to understand what was happening. I didn't wait to find out. I sprinted down the hallway, the whispering growing louder as I ran. The elevator was my only way out, but as I stepped inside, the doors slammed shut, the lights flickering before plunging me into darkness. The whispering was all around me now, a chorus of indistinct voices, each one filled with urgency and fear. The elevator descended, the walls creaking and groaning as if under pressure. When the doors finally opened at the ground floor, I stumbled out, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I didn't look back as I ran out of the building and into the night. The whispering faded into the distance, but the sense of fear remained. With me, a constant reminder that I had seen something I couldn't explain. I never stayed late at the office again, not after that night. The memory of the elevator, the whispering voices, and my boss's office light turning on without explanation haunted me. I knew there was something in that building, something that didn't belong, and I had no intention of finding out what it was. Driving through rural areas at night had always been a bit unsettling for me. The isolation, the pitch-black darkness that stretched out in every direction, and the winding roads that seemed to go on forever. But on this particular night, I was in a hurry to get back to the city, and the rural route was the quickest way home. The moon was a faint crescent in the sky, casting just enough light to make out the outlines of the surrounding fields and trees. My car's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the narrow road ahead. I was driving at a steady pace, the hum of the engine a comforting constant in the otherwise silent night. About halfway through my journey, my car started to sputter. It was a subtle change at first, just a slight hesitation. When I pressed the gas pedal, but as I continued driving, the sputtering grew worse, until the engine finally gave out with a loud cough. The car coasted to a stop on the side of the road, the headlights dimming as the engine died completely. I sighed in frustration, knowing that I was miles from the nearest town and without cell phone service in this remote area. I popped the hood and grabbed my flashlight, stepping out of the car to check the engine. The night air was cool and carried the faint scent of damp earth and pines. The quiet was almost oppressive, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl. As I inspected the engine, I heard the sound of a car approaching in the distance. The faint rumble of an engine grew louder, accompanied by the glow of headlights. I felt a surge of relief, thinking that maybe someone could help me get my car started again. I stood by the side of the road, waving my flashlight to signal the approaching vehicle. The car drew closer, a sleek black sedan. But as it reached my location, it slowed to a stop several yards ahead of me. The headlights remained on, casting a blinding glow across the road. I squinted against the light, trying to see who was driving, but the windows were tinted, and I couldn't make out anything through the glare. I waited for a moment, expecting someone to get out and offer assistance, but the car remained still, its engine idling softly. The longer I stood there, the more uneasy I became. There was something off about the way the car had stopped, the way the headlights didn't dim or flicker. It was as if the car itself was watching me. I called out, asking if anyone was there, but there was no response. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I took a cautious step forward, my flashlight pointed at the sedan, hoping to catch a glimpse. Put up the driver, but as I moved, the car's engine roared to life, and it reversed abruptly, tires screeching as it sped backward down the road. I stood there, stunned, as the sedan disappeared into the night, its headlights fading into the distance. My heart raced, a mix of confusion and fear coursing through my veins. I didn't know what to make of it. Why had the car stopped only to leave? Without a word, I turned my attention back to my own car, but the engine still wouldn't start. I felt a growing sense of dread, knowing that I was stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no way to call for help. The road stretched out into darkness, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being wounded, watched. I decided to start walking, hoping to find a farmhouse or some sign of civilization. The road was long and winding with dense trees on either side. The flashlight's beam barely pierced the darkness, casting eerie shadows that seemed to shift and move as I walked. Every rustle in the bushes made me jump, my nerves on edge. After what felt like an eternity, I saw headlights approaching from the opposite direction. It was a different car, a rusty pickup truck, and it was moving slowly. I stepped to the side of the road, waving my flashlight to get the driver's attention. The truck slowed to a crawl, and the driver's side window rolled down, revealing an elderly man with a grizzled beard. "Car trouble?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. I nodded, explaining that my car had broken down, and I had no way to call for help. The man offered to give me a ride to the nearest town, and I gratefully accepted. As I climbed into the truck, I glanced back at the road, half expecting to see the black sedan returning, but there was nothing, just the empty stretch of highway disappearing into the night. The drive to town was quiet, the elderly man focused on the road ahead. I felt a sense of relief, knowing that I was no longer alone. But the memory of the black sedan and its blinding headlights lingered in my mind. There was something unsettling about the way it had stopped and then abruptly left something that didn't make sense. I thanked the man for the ride. As we reached the outskirts of the town, he dropped me off at a gas station where I could call for a tow truck and arrange for a ride home. As I stood under the bright lights of the station, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped. Be something dangerous. The memory of the black sedan, its headlights glaring into the night, would stay with me long after that eerie drive through the rural landscape. Story 6. Working the night shift as a security guard at the old museum was supposed to be an easy gig. The building itself was a relic with creaking floors and dimly lit corridors that gave it a haunted vibe. But I didn't mind. I liked the quiet, and the steady rounds helped keep my mind occupied during the long hours. The museum had a history of being understaffed and underfunded, which explained why they hired someone like me with minimal experience. Most of the exhibits were antiques, dusty relics from bygone eras that didn't attract many visitors. The main attraction was the Egyptian wing with its mummies and ancient artifacts. But even that had lost its charm over the years. One night I was doing my rounds when I noticed something strange. In the Egyptian wing, there was a display of ancient hieroglyphs, a large stone tablet encased in glass, but the glass was slightly ajar. It wasn't broken, just tilted at an odd angle. I knew I hadn't seen it like that before, and it made me wonder if someone had tampered with it during the day. I went to fix the glass, pushing it back into place, when I heard a faint clicking sound. It was coming from behind the display, like the sound of gears turning. I leaned in, trying to locate the source of the noise, and noticed a small gap in the wall. It was a hidden door, cleverly concealed among the ornate carvings on the stone tablet. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. I pulled the door open, expecting to find a maintenance closet or a storage room. But what I saw instead made my heart race. It was a small, windowless room, lit by the dim glow of computer screens. Along one wall was a row of surveillance monitors, each one displaying live feeds from different locations. At first, I thought they were security cameras for the museum. But as I looked closer, I realized that the scenes on the screens weren't from the museum at all. They were from people's homes, living rooms, kitchens, bedrooms, all captured in real time. The images were clear, showing people going about their nightly routines, completely unaware that they were being watched. A chill ran down my spine as I scanned the screens, recognizing a few familiar places. One screen showed the interior of a local coffee shop, its owner cleaning up for the night. Another displayed a bedroom with a couple sound asleep in bed. There were more: a child's playroom, a family's dining room, an elderly woman's front porch, all being watched without their knowledge. I felt a surge of anger and fear, wondering who could have set this up and why it was hidden in the museum. It was a massive invasion of privacy, something that should never have existed. I backed out of the room, my mind racing with questions. Who was responsible for this? Why was it hidden behind a museum display? What other secrets were concealed within these walls? I knew I had to report it, but I didn't know who to trust. The museum had a reputation for being corrupt, with rumors of illegal activities and backroom deals. I couldn't be sure if my superiors were involved, or if they were simply ignorant of what was happening. I decided to leave the museum and call police from a safe location, fearing that if I stayed, I might be in danger. As I made my way back through the Egyptian wing, I heard footsteps behind me. They were soft but deliberate, each step echoing in the empty corridors. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. But the footsteps grew louder, as if someone was following me. I turned a corner and hid behind a large sarcophagus, my breathing shallow as I listened. The footsteps approached, then stopped abruptly, like the person knew I was there. I felt a surge of panic, realizing that I was alone in a museum with someone who might not have good intentions. I peeked around the sarcophagus and saw a shadowy figure standing in the hallway. The person was tall, dressed in dark clothing. Their face hidden beneath the hood, they stood still, as if listening for any sound. I held my breath, hoping they wouldn't find me. But then they started moving again, heading toward the hidden door. I took the opportunity to make my escape, running as quietly as I could toward the museum's exit. The old wooden floors creaked beneath my weight, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out of there. As I reached the front door, I heard a loud crash from the Egyptian wing, followed by the sound of breaking glass. I didn't wait to see what had happened. I burst through the exit and into the night, the cool air hitting me like a shock. I ran to my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I could still hear the footsteps in my mind, that steady rhythm that felt like a countdown to something terrible. I called the police from my car, telling them everything I had seen. They said they would send officers to investigate, but I knew I couldn't go back there, not after what I had discovered. The hidden door, the surveillance equipment, the wall of screens showing live feeds from inside people's homes. It was too much, too dangerous. I quit my job at the museum the next day, leaving without saying a word to anyone. I knew that I had stumbled upon something dark, something that would take a long time to unravel. I never returned to the museum, and I never spoke of what I had seen. But the memory of that hidden room, with its wall of screens and the silent footsteps in the night, would haunt me for the rest of my life. Story 7, being a janitor at a high school isn't the most glamorous job, but I didn't mind it. The hours were steady and the work was straightforward. I spent my nights cleaning classrooms, emptying trash cans, and making sure the hallways were tidy. For the next day, the school had its fair share of teenage antics, but nothing too out of the ordinary. Until the graffiti started showing up. The first time I saw it was in one of the stairwells. A simple symbol scrawled in black marker. It looked like a triangle with a circle inside, not unlike some band logos I'd seen. I cleaned it off, thinking it was just a bit of teenage rebellion. But the next night there were more symbols, this time in the second floor hallway. They were different lines, dots, and other geometric shapes. Shapes like someone was leaving a message, but I couldn't make sense of it. The graffiti kept appearing each night more intricate than the last. I did my best to clean it off, but it was getting harder to keep up. The symbols were becoming more complex, and they seemed to be leading somewhere, a path through the school that I couldn't follow. I mentioned it to the security guard, but he just shrugged, saying it was probably just kids messing around. But then I saw the message. It was on the wall outside the gym, written in bold black letters, "Meet me at the gym tonight." It was clear. No symbols or codes, just a straightforward invitation. It made my skin crawl, the idea that someone was planning something at the school after hours. I knew I had to do something, but I wasn't sure what. I decided to investigate to see if I could figure out who was behind the graffiti and what they were planning. I kept an eye on the gym that night, my mop and bucket nearby as an excuse to be there. The hours passed slowly, the school empty and silent. I heard the distant creak of old pipes and the occasional echo of footsteps, but nothing out of the ordinary. As midnight approached, I started to think I was overreacting. Maybe it was just a prank, a way for some students to spook the janitor. But then I heard a noise, a faint whisper coming from the gym. It was quiet, barely audible, but it was there. I crept closer, my heart racing as I reached the gym door. I peered through the small window in the door and saw a figure standing in the middle of the gymnasium. It was hard to make out any details. The lights were dim and the figure was wearing a hooded jacket, but I could see them pacing back and forth, their hands gesturing as if they were talking to someone. I knew I should leave, call the security guard, and let him deal with it. But something made me stay. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the growing sense of unease that had been building all week. I decided to enter the gym, my keys jangling in my pocket as I unlocked the door. The figures stopped pacing as I stepped inside their head, turning to face me. I could feel their gaze, even though I couldn't see their eyes. The air in the gym felt colder, the echoes of my footsteps bouncing off the walls. I took a step forward, my voice shaking as I spoke. "Who are you?" I asked, trying to sound confident. The figure didn't answer, just stood there, silent and still. I took another step, my hand tightening around the handle of my mop. The gym felt vast, the dim lights casting eerie shadows across the floor. "Why did you write that message?" I asked, my voice growing louder. The figure moved suddenly, darting toward the far end of the gym. I felt a surge of panic, my instincts telling me to run, but I stood my ground. The figure disappeared into the darkness, the sound of their footsteps fading as they left the gym. I rushed to the exit, my heart pounding in my chest. The school felt like a maze, the hallways twisting and turning in ways that made no sense. I could hear distant whispers like the walls themselves were talking, but I couldn't make out the words. I finally made it to the security office, bursting through the door to find the guard asleep at his desk. I shook him awake, my words tumbling out in a frantic rush. He looked at me with bleary eyes, his expression one of disbelief. "You sure you didn't just imagine it?" he asked, yawning. I knew what I had seen, but I couldn't prove it. There were no cameras in the gym, and the graffiti was just symbols and random words. I felt a sense of helplessness, realizing that whatever was happening, I was on my own. The next day, I noticed more graffiti, this time in the teacher's lounge. It was the same symbol I'd seen in the stairwell, but it was larger, more elaborate. It felt like a warning, a message that something was coming, something I couldn't understand. I quit my job at the high school soon after, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. The whispers in the gym, the hooded figure, and the coded messages were too much for me to handle. I never went back, and I never found out what was really happening in that old school. But the memory of that night in the gym would haunt me for years to come. Story 8. The small town had a reputation for being quiet and uneventful. The kind of place where everyone knew each other's business, and the local diner served as the social hub. But recently things had taken a dark turn. People had started disappearing, vanishing without a trace. It wasn't just a few isolated cases. It was a pattern, a chilling string of disappearances that had left the town on edge. As a freelance investigator, I was used to digging into mysteries, but this one had me stumped. There were no leads, no clues, just empty spaces where people used to be. I spent days interviewing locals, searching for anything that might give me a hint about what was happening. The more I asked, the more I realized that the townspeople were nervous, reluctant to talk about the disappearances, as if discussing them might bring bad luck. One day, I found myself in an old bookstore on the outskirts of town. It was a dusty, cluttered place with creaking wooden floors and shelves stacked with books from floor to to ceiling. The owner was a reclusive man, always peering at customers from behind his glasses as if he expected them to cause trouble. I was browsing through the shelves, hoping to find something that might connect the dots, when I noticed a small door at the back of the store. It was slightly ajar, revealing a dark room beyond. Curiosity got the better of me, and I slipped through the door, careful not to make any noise. The room was cramped, filled with boxes and old furniture. But what caught my eye was a pile of books in the corner. They were old, their covers worn and faded, but one stood out. A diary bound in leather and fastened with a brass clasp. I opened. It dire my heart, racing as I flipped through the pages. The handwriting was neat but hurried, as if the writer was in a rush to get their thoughts down. The entries were detailed, each one describing a person who had disappeared from the town. There were dates, times, and locations, all meticulous recorded. But what was even more disturbing were the hints at a secret society, a shadowy group that seemed to be operating behind the scenes. The diary mentioned strange meetings in the woods, hidden gatherings in abandoned buildings, and whispers of rituals that took place under the covert of night. The writers seemed to know more than they were, letting on their words, carefully chosen to avoid revealing too much. But the sense of danger was palpable, a constant undercurrent in every entry. As I read further, I found references to symbols and signs, cryptic drawings that matched the ones I'd seen around town. The symbols were like a secret language, a code that only a select few could understand. The diary hinted at a larger conspiracy, something that went far beyond the simple disappearances I'd been investigating. I was so engrossed in the diary that I didn't hear the sound of footsteps behind me. The floor creaked, and I spun round, the diary clutched tightly in my hand. It was the bookstore owner. His eyes narrowed as he stared at me. "You're not supposed to be back here," he said, his voice low and threatening. I tried to play it cool, pretending. I was just curious about the old books, but he wasn't buying it. He took a step closer, his hand reaching out as if to grab the diary from me. I backed away, my instincts telling me to run. But I didn't want to let go of the evidence I had found. "You need to leave," he said, his tone menacing. "This isn't your business." I knew I had to get out of there, but I couldn't just walk away. I needed the diary, the clues it contained, if I was going to solve the mystery of the disappearances. I decided to make a break for it, darting past the bookstore owner and racing toward the front of the store. He shouted after me, his voice echoing off, "Balls!" But I didn't look back. I burst out of the bookstore and into the street, the diary tucked under my arm. The town was quiet, the sun setting behind the buildings, casting long shadows across the pavement. I ran as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest, not stopping until I reached my car. I knew I couldn't go back to the bookstore, not after what had happened. The owner was clearly hiding something, and I had a feeling he was connected to the secret society mentioned in the diary. I needed to find a safe place to read the rest of the entries, to piece together the clues and uncover the truth. I drove to a secluded spot on the outskirts of town, a place where I could read without being disturbed. As I flipped through the pages, the diary revealed more about the secret society, a group that had been operating in the town for decades. Their activities hidden from prying eyes. The symbols, the meetings in the woods, the rituals. It was all part of a larger plan, one that seemed to revolve around the disappearances. The diary mentioned names, people who were part of the society, and I recognized a few of them from my interviews. It was clear that they were powerful, influential figures in the town people who could make someone disappear without a trace. I felt a surge of fear, realizing that I was dealing with something far more dangerous than I had anticipated. I knew I couldn't go to the local authorities. The secret society had connections everywhere. I had to take matters into my own hands to find a way to expose the truth without putting myself in danger. The diary was my only hope, my only weapon against the darkness that had taken hold of the town. I spent the night reading and taking notes, my mind racing with possibilities. The secret society had been operating in the shadows for too long, and I was determined to bring them to light. But as I pieced together the clues, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, that the secret society knew I had the diary and was coming to take it back. I didn't know who to trust or where to turn, but I knew one thing for sure. The diary was the key to unraveling the mystery of the disappearances, and I wasn't going to let it go without a fight. The small town had its secrets, and I was determined to uncover them no matter the cost. Story 9, Sitting for My Friend, seemed like an easy favor. She had a beautiful home on the edge of town, nestled in a quiet neighborhood surrounded by woods. The place had a cozy feel with antique furniture, and soft lighting that made it feel like a step back in time. She was going to be away for a week, and I was happy to keep an eye on things, feed her cat and water her plants. But I never expected to stumble upon what I did in her basement. It was the third night of my stay, and I was making my way through by the house, turning off the lights and checking the doors. Everything seemed normal. The cat curled up on the couch, and the plants thriving in their spots by the windows. But as I passed by the basement door, I noticed something odd. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible through the crack. I was sure I had closed it earlier, but maybe I'd just forgotten. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened the basement door, flicking on the light switch. The basement was large, with concrete floors and walls lined with shelves filled with boxes and old furniture. It was the kind of place where you stored things you didn't want to throw away, but had no use for any more. I stepped down the creaking wooden stairs, my footsteps echoing in the dimly lit space. As I explored, I noticed a corner of the basement that seemed darker than the rest. The light from the overhead bulb didn't quite reach it, casting it in shadow. I moved closer, my eyes adjusting to the dimness, and that's when I saw it. A trapdoor hidden behind a stack of old crates. It was wooden with a rusted metal handle, and it was slightly open, as if someone had recently used it. My heart raced as I lifted the trapdoor, the creak of the hinges sending a shiver down my spine. A narrow set of stairs led down into a pitch-black space below. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should leave it alone, but my curiosity pushed me forward. I grabbed my phone turned on the flashlight and ascended the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. At the bottom, I found a makeshift laboratory. It was a small room, cramped and filled with old medical equipment, rusty surgical tools, glass beakers, and metal trays. There were workbenches along the walls, cluttered with papers and faded photographs. It looked like something out of a horror movie, a place where terrible things had happened. I picked up one of the photographs, holding it under the light of my phone. It showed a person strapped to a table, their eyes wide with fear. There were wires and tubes attached to their body, leading to strange machines in the background. The other photographs were similar, each one depicting a different person undergoing some kind of bizarre experiment. My stomach churned as I realized what I had stumbled upon. This wasn't just a hidden room. It was a secret lab, a place where someone had been conducting unethical experiments on people. I felt a surge of panic, wondering who had built this place, why, and what had happened to the people in the photographs. I knew I needed to leave, to call the police and report what I had found, but I couldn't resist looking through the papers on the workbenches. They were covered in scribbled notes and diagrams detailing the experiments and the results. It was all technical jargon, but the general idea was clear. Someone had been trying to manipulate human behavior, to control the mind in ways that were unnatural. As I reached for another photograph, I heard a noise from above. It was faint, like the creak of a floorboard, but it was enough to make me freeze. I listened, my heart racing as the sound grew louder, like someone was moving around in the basement. I knew I had to get out of there to escape before I was discovered. But the narrow staircase felt like a trap. I grabbed a few of the papers and photographs, shoving them into my pocket, and headed for the stairs. The creaking grew louder as I climbed the footsteps, approaching the trapdoor from above. I was almost at the top when the trapdoor swung open, a shadowy figure silhouetted against the light. I panicked, my mind racing with thoughts of being caught in this hidden lab. I stumbled backward, my foot slipping on the stairs, but I caught myself before I fell. The figures stood at the top of the stairs, blocking my escape. I couldn't see their face, just the outline of their body against the light from the basement. Without thinking, I lunged forward, pushing past the figure and scrambling out of the trapdoor. The basement was a blur as I ran for the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the figure chasing after me, their footsteps heavy and deliberate, but I didn't look back. I burst through the basement door and into the hallway, slamming it shut behind me. I knew I couldn't stay in the house, not after what I'd found and the danger I was in. I grabbed my keys and ran out the front door, my pulse racing as I sprinted to my car. As I drove away, I could still hear the footsteps in my mind, each step a reminder of the horrors I'd uncovered in that hidden laboratory. I called the police, telling them about the trapdoor and the strange lab in the basement. They said they would investigate, but I knew I couldn't go back to my friend's house. The images from the photographs, the old medical equipment, and the shadowy figure chasing me. It was all too much, too dangerous. I never spoke to my friend about it, never explained why I couldn't house sit for her again. But I knew one thing for sure. The hidden trapdoor in her basement was a doorway to something dark and sinister. and I was lucky to have escaped with my life story. Delivering mail in the suburbs had always been a routine job. Each day I walked my route through the quiet streets where the lawns were always freshly mowed and the houses looked pristine. It was the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew each other, where kids played in the streets without a worry in the world. But one house had always stood out. It was at the end of the cul-de-sac, shrouded in overgrown bushes, with windows boarded up and paint peeling from the walls. It had been abandoned for years, a relic of a time when the neighborhood had seen better days. No one talked about the house. It was like a ghost among the immaculate homes. Neighbors avoided it, kids steered clear, and even pets seemed to sense something was off. I always glanced at it when I passed by, feeling a chill run down my spine every time, but nothing prepared me for what I discovered on that sunny afternoon. I was sorting through the mail, making my usual rounds, when I noticed a stack of envelopes addressed to the abandoned house. It struck me as odd, given that no one had lived there for years. The postmark dates were recent, within the past few weeks, and the return address was local, but what caught my eye was the handwriting. It was eerily familiar, the kind of cursive style that seemed to belong to another era. I knew I shouldn't have, but my curiosity got the better of me. I pulled one of the envelopes out of the stack and held it up to the light. The handwriting was precise, each letter flowing into the next with a smooth, almost practiced elegance. It reminded me of my grandfather's handwriting, the kind you rarely saw anymore. I glanced around, making sure no one was watching, and then slipped the envelope into my pocket. It felt wrong, like I was breaking some kind of code, but I couldn't help it. The abandoned house, the recent mail, the familiar handwriting. It was too much to ignore. I finished my route, my mind racing with questions. Who was sending these letters? Why to an abandoned house? And why did the handwriting look so familiar? I couldn't stop thinking about it, the unease growing with each passing minute. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table, the envelope in front of me. I hesitated, wondering if I was crossing a line, but my curiosity pushed me forward. I opened it carefully, the paper crinkling in my hands, and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a letter handwritten in the same elegant cursive. The letter was addressed to someone named John. It was brief, just a few sentences, but the words sent a chill down my spine. It spoke of unfinished business, of secrets that needed to stay buried. There was a sense of urgency in the tone, a warning that something was coming, and it was best to stay away. The letter ended with a cryptic phrase, "Meet me where the shadows fall." I felt a surge of fear, my heart racing as I read the words. Over and over. Who was John? What secrets needed to stay buried? And where was this meeting place where the shadows fell? The questions swirled in my mind, each one more unsettling than the last. I knew I had to go to the abandoned house to see if there were more clues, but the thought filled me with dread. It was late, the sun had set, and the street was eerily quiet. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way down the cul-de-sac, the darkness pressing in around me. The house loomed ahead, its silhouette stark against the night sky. I felt a chill as I approached the overgrown bushes rustling in the wind. The front door was boarded up, but there was a side entrance that was partially open, the wood splintered and rotting. I pushed the door open, the hinges creaking loudly. The air inside was musty, filled with the scent of decay. I shone my flashlight around, illuminating broken furniture and cobweb-covered corners. The place was a wreck, like it had been abandoned in a hurry, with no one bothering to clean up the mess. I made my way through the house, my footsteps echoing in the empty rooms. I found the living room, where a faded rug lay across the floor, and an old piano sat in the corner, its keys yellowed with age. It was like stepping into a time capsule, a glimpse into a life long forgotten. But what caught my attention was the wall on the far side of the room. It was covered in old photographs, each one pinned to the wallpaper with rusted tacks. They were black and white, depicting people from decades ago. But what struck me was that some of the faces looked familiar. They were the neighbors, the same people who lived in the houses down the street, but much younger, like they had been taken when the neighborhood was first built. I felt a surge of panic as I realized that these photographs were not just old memories. They were a warning, a reminder of something that had happened in this neighborhood, something that still lingered in the shadows. I heard a noise from upstairs, a faint creaking, like someone was walking along the floorboards. My heart raced as I backed away, my flashlight trembling in my hand. I knew I had to leave to get out of this place. Before I was caught, I turned and ran, the darkness swallowing me as I sprinted back through the broken door and into the night. The street was empty, the only sound, the distant rustling of leaves in the wind. As I reached my house, I heard the faint sound of a piano playing a haunting melody that seemed to come from the abandoned house. It echoed through the night, a reminder that some secrets should stay buried, that some places were best left alone. I never returned to the abandoned house, never spoke of what I had found. But I knew one thing for sure: the quiet suburban neighborhood wasn't as safe as it seemed, and the past had a way of coming back to haunt you. Story 11, working the night shift as a nurse at a mental institution, wasn't something most people aspired to, but I found it oddly comforting. The quiet corridors, the dim lighting, the occasional murmur from a patient in their sleep. It all had a rhythm to it. I knew my rounds, knew which patients needed extra care, and which ones would wander the halls if left unchecked. But one night everything changed, and I've never been able to forget was a slow night. The rain was tapping against the windows, casting a gentle, almost hypnotic rhythm. I was on my way to check the common room, a large space with old couches and dusty TV that nobody ever used. Most nights it was just a place to store wheelchairs and other equipment. But when I walked in, I stopped in my tracks. There was a man sitting on one of the couches, his back to me, his gaze fixed on the blank television screen. At first, I thought it was one of the new patients. Sometimes they wandered when they couldn't sleep, but something about his posture made me uneasy. He was sitting perfectly still, his shoulders squared, his hands resting on his knees. It was like he was waiting for something. I approached him slowly, my footsteps barely making a sound on the linoleum floor. As I got closer, I recognized him. It was Mr. Barnes, a patient who had been discharged years ago. He'd had a long history of mental illness, but he'd shown remarkable improvement and was deemed fit to leave the institution. Yet there he was in his usual spot, staring at the blank screen. I felt a chill run down my spine. This couldn't be right. I checked the security logs, flipping through the papers on the desk in the corner of the room. There was no record of Mr. Barnes being readmitted, no mention of him even visiting the institution. It was as if he had appeared out of nowhere. I turned back to him, my voice gentle but firm. "Mr. Barnes, what are you doing here?" He didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge my presence. He just kept staring at the television, his eyes unblinking. I felt a surge of panic, wondering if he was in some kind of trance. But when I reached out to touch his shoulder, he flinched, his whole body tensing. "It's okay," I said, trying to soothe him. "You're not supposed to be here. Let's get you back to your room." He turned to look at me, and his eyes were filled with fear. "They're coming," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "They never really left. They're watching us." I felt a shiver run down my spine. His words were so quiet, yet they seemed to echo through the room. I tried to reassure him, telling him that nobody was coming, but he just shook his head, his gaze returning to the television. I knew I had to get him out of there, but I was hesitant to use force. I called for backup, radioing the security guard on duty when he arrived. I explained the situation, showing him the security logs that proved Mr. Barnes shouldn't be here. The guard was just as baffled as I was, but he didn't hesitate to escort Mr. Barnes out of the common room. As we were leading him back to his room, he started to mutter to himself, his words incoherent, but filled with anxiety. He kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting to see someone following us. I felt a sense of dread, wondering what he had seen, what had brought him back to the institution after all these years. We got him back to his room and made sure he was comfortable. I called the head nurse, explaining the situation, and she promised to look into it in the morning. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that there was more to this than a simple mix-up. The rest of the night was uneventful, but I kept thinking about Mr. Barnes, about the fear in his eyes, and his whispered words about them coming back. I went over the security logs, again searching for any clue, but there was nothing. It was as if he had never existed, as if he had been erased from the institution's records. The next day I came in early, eager to hear what the head nurse had found. She greeted me with a confused expression, telling me that there was no record of Mr. Barnes being a patient, not in the past or the present. I insisted that he had been there the night before, but she just shook her head, dismissing it as a hallucination or a dream brought on by stress. I knew what I had seen. I had spoken to Mr. Barnes, touched his shoulder, and seen the fear in his eyes. But nobody believed me. The other nurses gave me strange looks, as if I had lost my mind. Even the security guard, who had helped me escort him back to his room, claimed he didn't remember any of it. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality, like the institution itself was playing tricks on me. I couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Barnes, about his warning that they were watching. I started to see shadows moving in the corners of my vision, hear faint whispers in the empty hallways. It was as if the institution had come alive, its walls breathing with hidden secrets. I quit my job soon, after unable to handle the growing sense of unease. The night shift at the mental institution had become a nightmare, a place where reality and delusion blurred into one. I never went back, never spoke of what I had experienced, but I knew one thing for sure. Something was watching, something that didn't belong in this world, and it was waiting for the right moment to make its presence known. Story 13. My grandfather's attic was a place I'd rarely visited, was one of those spaces that held years of forgotten memories packed tight with dusty boxes and old furniture. After he passed away, I was tasked with clearing it out, sorting through the clutter, and deciding what to keep. I wasn't expecting to find much, maybe some old trinkets or forgotten books. But what I discovered changed everything I thought I knew about my family. The attic was dark, the only light coming from a single bulb hanging from the rafters. I climbed up the rickety ladder, dust swirling around me as I reached the top. The air was musty, filled with the scent of old wood and decaying paper. Boxes were piled high, some of them stacked so precariously that I had to be careful not to knock them over. I started with the smaller boxes, sorting through old clothes, newspapers, and faded letters. Most of it was mundane, the kind of stuff you'd expect to find in an attic. But then I found the box of photographs. It was tucked away in the corner, covered with a layer of dust so thick I had to wipe it off with my sleeve. The box was unremarkable, just a simple cardboard container, but the photographs inside were anything but ordinary. At first, they seemed like typical family photos. There were pictures of my grandparents, when they were young, smiling at the camera in their Sunday best. There were shots of family gatherings, birthdays, and holidays. But as I sifted through them, I came across a set of photographs that made my heart skip a beat. They were black and white, clearly from decades ago. But the subject of the photos was a man who looked just like me. The resemblance was uncanny. Same facial structure, same hair color, even the same dimple in his cheek when he smiled. It was like looking into a mirror. But these photos were dated long before I was born. I felt a chill run down my spine as I examined the photographs. There was no mistaking if the man in the photos could have been my twin. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothing, a suit and tie that looked like it was from the 1940s or 50s. He was in various settings in front of a house, at a park, sitting on a bench by a river. But each photo had the same eerie familiarity. I turned the photographs over, searching for any clues. Some had dates written on the back, all from the mid-20th century. But there were no names, no identifying information. I checked the other photos in the box, hoping to find a connection. But there was nothing. It was as if this man had been erased from our family history, leaving behind only these haunting images. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that there was a mystery here that needed solving. I took the photos downstairs and showed them to my parents, hoping they might have some answers. But they were just as confused as I was. My father swore he'd never seen the man before, and my mother suggested it might be a distant relative, someone who bore a striking resemblance to me. but I couldn't accept that explanation. The resemblance was too strong to exact. I decided to dig deeper, to see if I could find any records or documents that might shed light on who this man was, and why he looked just like me. I spent hours searching through old family albums, digging through the attic, and even asking distant relatives if they knew anything about him. But I came up empty-handed. The more I searched, the more obsessed I became. I couldn't stop thinking. About the photographs, about the man who seemed to share my face, but had lived decades before I was born. I started to have dreams about him. Vivid images of him walking through the same places I did. His presence like a shadow that followed me everywhere. One night I had a particularly vivid dream. I was in my grandfather's attic, but it was different. Cleaner, brighter, like it had been restored to its former glory. The man from the photographs was there, standing in the corner, his back to me. I called out to him, asking who he was, but he didn't turn around. Instead, he raised a hand and pointed toward the window where the moonlight streamed in through the dusty glass. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. The dream felt so real, so immediate, that I couldn't shake the sense of urgency. I returned to the attic, retracing my steps, hoping to find something I'd missed. And then I saw, at the window, partially obscured by boxes with a small latch at the bottom. I moved the boxes aside and opened the window, the old hinges creaking as I pushed it open. There was a small ledge outside, barely wide enough to stand on, but I could see something tucked into the corner. It was a small envelope, weathered and yellowed with age. I reached out and grabbed it, feeling a surge of anticipation as I carefully opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded neatly. It was a letter written in the same handwriting I'd seen on the back of the photographs. It was from my grandfather, addressed to my future grandson. The letter was short, but it explained everything. The man in the photographs was his twin brother, a brother he never spoke of, who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The letter hinted at a family secret, a rift that had torn the brothers apart, but it didn't go into detail. I felt a mix of relief and sadness as I read the letter. The mystery of the man in the photographs was solved, but it left me with more questions than answers. What had happened to my great-uncle? Why had my grandfather never mentioned him? And what was this secret that had caused such a deep rift in the family? I knew I had to dig deeper to uncover the truth behind my family's history. The photographs, the letter, and the dreams, they were all pieces of a puzzle that I was determined to solve. I would not let my great-uncle's memory fade into obscurity, and I would uncover the secrets that had been hidden for far too long. The attic had opened a door to the past, and I was ready to step through it no matter what I might find on the other side. Story 14. The subway was my preferred way to get home from work. It was efficient, usually on time, and gave me a chance to decompress after a long day. I usually kept my head down, earbuds in, trying to blend into the crowd. But that night everything felt off. It started with a man in a long coat standing at the far end of the platform, watching me intently. At first I thought he was just another commuter, but his gaze never wavered even as the crowd shifted and moved. I tried to ignore him, focusing on the music in my ears. But I could feel his eyes on me. The train arrived, and I stepped into the crowded car, hoping he would stay behind. But he followed, positioning himself at the opposite end, his coat brushing the floor as he leaned against the metal pole. I couldn't make out his features. His face was hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, but I could sense his focus on me as it heaved, studying my every move. The train rumbled through the tunnels, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. I glanced around, hoping to find someone else watching him, someone else noticing how out of place he seemed. But the other passengers were absorbed in their own worlds, reading, sleeping, staring at their phones. No one seemed to notice the man in the long coat. My usual stop was coming up, and I decided to get off, thinking he would continue on with the train. I stepped onto the platform, the familiar smell of oil and damp concrete filling the air. But as I glanced back, I saw him stepping off to his long coat, sweeping behind him as he moved through the crowd. I felt a surge of fear, wondering why he was following me. I walked quickly, weaving through the throngs of people, heading for the exits. I took a different route than usual, hoping to lose him in the crowd. But when I glanced over my shoulder, he was still there, keeping his distance, but never losing sight of me. It felt like a game of cat and mouse, but I was the one being hunted. I decided to confront him, to turn round and demand to know why he was following me. I spun on my heels, ready to face him, but he was gone. The platform was crowded, but he had vanished, disappearing into the sea of people. I felt a chill run down my spine, wondering how he could have vanished so quickly. As I stood there, catching my breath, I noticed something on the ground, a small envelope lying just a few feet from where I'd turned around. It was plain, with my name written in large, bold letters across the front. I picked it up, my hands trembling as I turned it over. There was no return address, no postmark, just my name, scrawled in thick black ink. I opened the envelope, my heart racing, and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a handwritten note, brief but direct. You shouldn't have come here. Leave before it's too late. The words and a shiver down my spine, each letter sharp and jagged, as if written in haste. I looked around, expecting to see the man in the long coat watching from the shadows, but there was no sign of him. The platform was bustling with people, but I felt utterly alone, as if I were the only one who knew something was wrong. I knew I had to leave, to get out of the subway and find a safe place to think. I took the stairs 2 at a time, my footsteps echoing in the stairwell, the words of the note repeated in my mind, each repetition adding to my sense of urgency. I reached the street, the city lights casting a harsh glow, and I blended into the crowd, hoping to lose myself among the pedestrians. As I walked, I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see the man in the long coat following me. But he was nowhere to be seen, as if he'd vanished into thin air. I found a coffee shop, a small place with dim lighting in quiet corners, and I took a seat by the window, my back against the wall. I knew I needed to figure out who the man was and why he'd left me that note. The warning was clear, but it raised more questions than it answered. What was I supposed to leave the subway, the city? And why was it too late? I felt a surge of frustration, the uncertainty gnawing at me like a persistent itch. I decided to go to the police, to show them the note and explain what had happened. But as I reached into my pocket, the envelope and the note were gone. I searched my pockets, the floor beneath the table, even the path I took to get to the coffee shop. But there was no sign of was, as if the warning had never existed, as if it had been a figment of my imagination. The rest of the night was a blur, the fear and confusion overwhelming my thoughts. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything but the man in the long coat and the cryptic message he left behind. I knew I had to be cautious to watch my back, because someone out there knew who I was and didn't want me to stay. The city no longer felt safe, the familiar streets now filled with shadows and hidden threats. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the man in the long coat was out there waiting for the right moment to make his move. I was no longer just another commuter. I was a target, and I had to find out why before it was too late. Story 15, the old mansion, was an architectural marvel, a relic of a bygone era with ornate woodwork and towering stone facades. My crew had been hired to renovate the place, to bring it back to life after decades of neglect. The mansion had a reputation, bin town, with stories of hidden passages and ghostly apparitions. Most people brushed it off as folklore, but the truth was even more unsettling. We'd been working on the ground floor, tearing down old plants, plaster, and reinforcing the structure. The dust was thick in the air, and the sound of hammers and saws echoed through the empty halls. It was hard work, but we were used to it. The mansion was full of surprises. Hidden compartments in the walls, secret staircases leading to nowhere. But nothing prepared us for what we found behind the false wall. It was during the afternoon shift. We were working in what used to be the library, a grand room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a massive fireplace at one end. As we removed a section of the wall, one of the workers noticed a hollow sound when he struck a particular spot. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to pique our curiosity. We cleared away the plaster and found a seam, a thin line, where the wall met the floor. It was a hidden door, cleverly disguised to look like part of the structure. We pried it open, expecting to find a storage closet, or maybe an old passageway. But what we discovered was far more disturbing. The room was small, barely large enough to stand in it. Had no windows, no light fixtures, just stacks of missing person posters piled high against the walls. They were old, yellowed with age, but the faces on the posters were hauntingly familiar. They were people from town, individuals who had vanished without a trace over the years. I recognized some of the names, stories that had made headlines and then faded into obscurity. But what sent chills down my spine was the message scrawled across the top of each poster. I know where they are. The words were written in bold, jagged letters, as if they were etched into the paper with a shaky hand. The message was clear, but its meaning was cryptic, raising more questions than answers. We stood there staring at the stacks of posters, unsure of what to do. The room felt like a tomb, a place where secrets had been buried and forgotten. I picked up one of the posters and examined it closely. The photo was of a young woman, her smile frozen in time, her eyes full of life. The date on the poster was from a decade ago, but the message across the top seemed fresh, as if someone had written it just recently. I knew we had to report it, to call the authorities and let them handle it. But something held me back, a nagging feeling that there was more to this than met the eye. The hidden room, the missing person posters, the cryptic message. It all felt like part of a larger puzzle, one that I was determined to solve. I took a few of the posters with me, tucking them into my tool belt as we left the hidden room. The rest of the crew continued with the renovation, but I couldn't stop thinking about the message. I know where they are, who had written it, and why. Had they hidden these posters behind a false wall that night? I did some research, looking up the names from the posters. Each one had a story, a history that had been forgotten over time. There were newspaper articles, police reports, and online forums dedicated to the missing, but no one had any answers, no leads that pointed to what had happened to them. I knew I had to dig deeper to find out who had left the message and why. I returned to the mansion after hours, the place eerily silent, without the sound of construction. I made my way back to the hidden room, flashlight in hand, my footsteps echoing in the empty halls. As I entered the room, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A small piece of paper tucked between the stacks of posters. It was a note, handwritten, but the words were smeared, as if someone had tried to erase them. I could only make out a few words. They are here, basement. Don't tell. I felt a surge of fear, the implications of the notes sinking in the basement of the mansion was a labyrinth, a network of rooms and corridors that had long been sealed off. If the missing people were down there, if the message was a clue to their whereabouts, then I had to find out for myself. I descended into the basement, my flashlight casting a dim glow in the darkness. The air was thick with dust and the scent of decay, the walls damp and crumbling. As I explored the maze of corridors, I heard faint sounds like whispers carried on. The wind. It was unsettling, the feeling of being watched, as if the walls themselves had eyes. I followed the sounds, my heart racing, until I reached a locked door at the end of a narrow passageway. The lock was old, rusted, but I managed to pry it open with my crowbar. The door creaked as it swung inward, revealing a small room filled with old furniture and broken crates. But what caught my attention was the faint outline of a trapdoor in the floor. I opened the trapdoor, the smell of damp earth wafting up from below. A narrow staircase led down into darkness, the steps slick with moisture. I hesitated for a moment, knowing that whatever was down there might be more than I could handle. But the words of the message echoed in my mind. I know where they are. I couldn't turn back now, not without finding out the truth. With a deep breath, I descended into the darkness, my flashlight flickering as I made my way down the narrow staircase. The basement held its secrets, and I was about to uncover them, no matter the cost. Each step down the staircase felt like a journey into another realm. The air was thicker here, a mixture of dampness and something else, something metallic and raw. My flashlight flickered, casting fleeting beams of light on the rough stone walls. The whispers I'd heard earlier grew louder, becoming more distinct, but I couldn't make out any words. It was like a chorus of lost voices overlapping and blending into a haunting sound symphony. As I reached the bottom of the staircase, I found myself in a narrow corridor that stretched out in both directions. The walls were lined with old pipes, some of which were corroded and leaking, creating small puddles on the floor. The corridor was dimly lit by a few flickering bulbs, but the light barely pierced the darkness ahead. I chose to turn left, feeling my way along the damp walls, my flashlight casting shaky circles of light. The corridor twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the bowels of the mansion. I passed by rusted doors, each one slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of forgotten storage rooms filled with broken furniture and discarded items. But then I reached a door that was different from the others. It was larger, with a heavy iron handle, and it was locked with a massive padlock. The lock was old and rusted, but it still seemed sturdy. I felt a surge of adrenaline, knowing that whatever lay behind this door was important. I used my crowbar to pry the lock open, the metal groaning in protest before it finally snapped. The door swung open, revealing a larger room with a single dim bulb hanging from the ceiling. The walls were lined with metal shelves, and on those shelves were rows of glass jars filled with murky liquid. I approached cautiously, my flashlight illuminating the contents of the jars, specimens preserved in formaldehyde. There were various body parts, some human, others animal, all carefully labeled with handwritten tags. I felt a wave of nausea, the realization of what I was seeing hitting me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a forgotten storage room. This was a laboratory, a place where someone had been conducting experiments, horrific experiments, that seemed to blend human and animal elements. The jars were filled with grotesque amalgamations, limbs with claws, faces with fangs, all suspended in a sickly greenish hue. As I backed away, I noticed a table at the far end of the room. It was covered with papers yellowed with age, and a single photograph sat atop the pile. I picked it up, my hands trembling as I turned it over. It was a picture of a group of people, scientists, by the looks of their lab coats, standing outside the mansion. They were all smiling, but there was something unsettling about their expressions, a sense of twisted satisfaction. I scanned the rest, the papers finding handwritten notes detailing the experiments, the goals, and the outcomes. The notes spoke of creating a new breed, of being a perfect blend of human intelligence and animal strength. The experiments had started decades ago, but the latest entries were far more recent, suggesting that someone had continued the work long after the original scientists had vanished. As I stood there, piecing together the horrifying reality of what had happened in this hidden laboratory, I heard a noise from the corridor. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching from the direction I had come. I felt a surge of panic, knowing that I wasn't alone in this dark, twisted place. The footsteps grew louder, the sound echoing off the stone walls, and I knew I had to hide. I ducked behind one of the shelves, my flashlight turned off, my breath shallow and silent. The footsteps entered the room, a figure silhouetted by the dim light from the corridor. I couldn't make out their features, but they were tall, wearing a long coat, their movements deliberate and controlled. They walked slowly through the room, their eyes scanning the shelves as if searching for something or someone. I held my breath, the papers crumpled in my fist, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure continued to move, their footsteps soft but menacing, each step a reminder that I was in the belly of the beast. I knew that if they found me, there would be no escape, no way to explain my presence in this secret laboratory. But then, as suddenly as they had entered, they left, their footsteps fading down the corridor. I waited, my body tense, listening for any sign of their return. When I was sure the coast was clear, I slipped out from behind the ship and made my way back to the door, my flashlight guiding me through the darkness. I climbed the narrow staircase, each step feeling like an eternity, the sounds of the mansion's hidden laboratory echoing in my ears. I reached the ground floor, the sense of normalcy returning. But I knew that what I had uncovered was far from normal. The hidden room, the missing person posters, the grotesque experiments. It was all part of a dark and twisted legacy, one that I was determined to expose. I left the mansion, the papers clutched tightly in my hand, and I knew that my renovation project was over. There was no turning back now. I would take what I had found to the authorities, to the police, to anyone who would listen. The mansion held its secrets, but I had seen enough to know that those secrets needed to be brought to light, no matter the cost. Story 16. Exploring old military bunkers had always fascinated me. The idea of delving into the hidden history of places long abandoned, where shadows of the past lingered like ghosts. This particular bunker was deep in the forest, a remnant from decades ago when the military had a strong presence in the area. It was off the beaten path, overgrown with vegetation, its entrance obscured by years of neglect. But I had heard rumors about its existence, and the thought of uncovering forgotten secrets drew me in. The entrance was a massive steel door, half buried in the earth. It took some effort to pry it open, the hinges groaning in protest as I pushed it inward. The air inside was stale and musty, filled with the scent of damp concrete. I clicked on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, revealing a narrow corridor that stretched into the depths of the bunker. The walls were lined with faded milk, military insignia, and old equipment was scattered along the corridor. Rusted metal crates, broken radio equipment, and piles of rotting wood. It was clear that the bunker hadn't been used in years, but the sense of history was palpable, as if the walls themselves held the echoes of past conversations. I made my way deeper into the bunker, the corridor twisting and turning, leading me to what looked like an office area. Desks were overturned, papers strewn across the floor, and the remains of old maps covered the walls. It was a scene of chaos, as if the place had been abandoned in a hurry. I sifted through the papers, most of them illegible due to water damage. But then I found something that made my heart race. A stack of classified documents bound together. With a metal clip, the documents were stamped with the word "Top Secret" in bold red letters. I carefully opened them, my hands trembling with anticipation, and began to read. The information inside was disturbing, detailing a series of experiments conducted during a period of conflict involving prisoners of war. The experiments were centered around psychological manipulation, with specific references to the nearby cemetery and unexplained anomalies in the area. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read through the documents. They described using prisoners to test various methods of inducing fear and manipulating their perceptions of reality. The experiments were harsh and inhumane, designed to break the will of the prisoners and extract information through unconventional means. The references to the cemetery suggested that some of the experiments had tragic outcomes, with bodies being buried in unmarked graves to cover up the evidence. As I flipped through the documents, I came across a section that mentioned strange occurrences in the area surrounding the bunker. There were reports of unexplained lights in the forest at night, voices that seemed to come from nowhere, and odd fluctuations in a land electromagnetic fields. The anomalies were dismissed as technical glitches, but the tone of the reports suggested that those writing them were uneasy about what was happening. I knew I had stumbled upon something significant, something that needed to be brought to light. I gathered the documents and made my way out of the bunker, my flashlight casting erratic beams as I hurried back down the corridor. The sense of urgency grew with each step, the knowledge that I was holding classified information that could unravel a dark chapter in military history. As I reached the entrance, I heard a noise behind me. The faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the bunker. I turned my flashlight, sweeping the corridor, but there was no one there. The footsteps grew louder, the sound bouncing off the concrete walls, and I felt a surge of fear. I knew I had to leave to get out before whoever was making those footsteps found me. I pushed open the heavy steel door and stepped into the forest, the cool night air hitting me like a shock. The footsteps continued, but now they were in the distance, as if following me from within the bottom bunker. I ran through the woods, the documents clutched tightly to my chest, my heart racing with adrenaline. The journey back to civilization felt like a blur, the forest closing in around me, the darkness filled with unseen threats. I knew I had to get these documents to the authorities, to expose the experiments and the pre-anomalies, to ensure that the victims of those inhumane tests were not forgotten. But the footsteps never left me. Even as I reached the edge of the forest and saw the lights of the town ahead, I could still hear them, faint but persistent, like the echoes of a past that refused to stay buried. The documents held the key to unraveling the truth, but they also carried with them the weight of the suffering that had taken place in that hidden bunker. The town's familiar lights didn't offer the comfort I hoped for. They only highlighted the contrast between civilization in the wilderness I had just escaped. The documents in my hands felt like both a treasure and a burden, a connection to the past that had to be explored, but one that also carried dangers I couldn't yet understand. I found my way to the local police station, the fluorescent lights flickering in the windows. The officer on duty looked up as I entered, his expression shifting from casual boredom to cautious curiosity. As I approached the counter with the stack of classified documents, I explained where I found them, describing the hidden bunker and the footsteps that had chased me out. The officer's eyes narrowed as he flipped through the documents, his face paling at some of the details. He excused himself to make a call, disappearing into a back office. I waited in the lobby, the hum of overhead lights blending with a distant murmur of voices from the adjoining rooms. The sense of unease I had felt in the forest lingered, like a shadow that refused to dissipate. The officer returned with a stern-looking detective who introduced himself and led me to a quieter room to discuss the documents. His questions were pointed, and he seemed particularly interested in the section that referenced the cemetery and the unexplained anomalies. I asked what he knew about the bunker, but his responses were evasive, as if he was unsure how much to reveal. "We'll need to investigate this further," the detective said, setting the documents aside. "But for your safety, I suggest you stay out of the forest. If what you found is accurate, it could be dangerous to go back." I nodded, but I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that there was more to the story, something the detective wasn't telling me. I left the station, my steps hesitant, as I walked back through the town. The streets were quiet, but every shadow seemed to hide something. Every passing car seemed as slow as it went by. Over the next few days, I noticed changes in the town. The local news reported a sudden surge in police activity around the forest, but no details were given. The cemetery, once a peaceful place where families visited loved ones, was closed to the public without explanation. Rumors circulated about strange lights in the sky at night and wind whispers of government involvement. The town, once a quiet retreat, felt like it was on the edge of something big, something unsettling. I knew I couldn't let it go. It documents the footsteps in the bunker, the unexplained anomalies. They were all connected to a darker truth, one that I had to uncover. I started researching the history of the town, looking into its ties to the military and any records of secret experiments. The deeper I dug, the more I realized that this wasn't just a local issue. It had implications that reached far beyond the town's borders. I revisited the bunker during the day this time with a friend who was a freelance journalist. We wanted to document what we found, to ensure that the truth couldn't be buried again. The bunker was quiet, the entrance partially sealed off by police tape. We managed to get inside, finding the corridor as dark and eerie as before. But this time, the hidden room was empty, the stacks of classified documents gone. As if someone had cleaned it out, we searched the bunker, finding signs of recent activity. Footprints in the dust, discarded items, and the faint smell of smoke. It was clear that someone had been there since my last visit, possibly trying to cover their tracks. But what disturbed me most was the sound of footsteps, faint and distant, echoing through the corridors. The footsteps grew louder as we explored, but no one appeared. It was as if the bunker itself was coming to life, the echoes bouncing off the walls, following us as we moved. My friend and I decided to leave, knowing that we were out of our depth. The truth we were seeking was buried deep, and we would need more help to bring it to light. As we left the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The footsteps had stopped, but the sense of unease remained like a dark cloud hanging over us. The documents, the hidden experiments, the references to the cemetery, was all part of a larger puzzle, one that I was determined to solve. But I knew it wouldn't be easy and that the dangers were real. I made my way back to town, my friend by my side, both of us determined to uncover the truth. The forest, the bunker, the cemetery, they all held secrets, and I knew would need to be careful. The darkness had its own rules, and if we weren't careful, we might find ourselves on the wrong side of them. Story 17. House hunting in a small town can be a mixed bag. Some places feel warm and welcoming, while others seem to carry the weight of old secrets. This particular house, a charming Victorian with ivy climbing up its stone wall, had caught my eye immediately. It was nestled on a quiet street, the kind where kids play in the front yard and neighbors wave as they pass by. And the price was unbelievably low, which should have been my first red flag. The owner, an older man with a polite smile and a thick accent, seemed eager to sell. He greeted me at the door with a first firm handshake and a slightly forced cheerfulness, as he led me through the house, pointing out its features. I noticed his hands trembling slightly in a faint sheen of sweat on his forehead. It was as if he couldn't wait to be rid of the place. The house itself was beautiful, with hardwood floors and ornate moldings that spoke to a bygone era. The rooms were spacious, and the light streamed through the tall windows in a way that made everything feel warm and inviting. But there was an underlying sense of neglect, like the house had been empty for a while, and the air was heavy with dust and faint echoes. As we finished the tour, one asked the owner why the price was so low. He hesitated, his eyes darting to the cellar door at the end of the hallway. Then he handed me a key, a large brass one with intricate designs, and said, "Take a look in the cellar." The words sent a chill down my spine. The cellar was where you stored old boxes and forgotten memories. But the way he said it made it sound like something else entirely. I took the key and walked down the hallway, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. The cellar door creaked as I opened it, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. I flicked on my flashlight and made my way down the stairs, the air growing colder with each step. The cellar was vast, stretching out beneath the entire house, its walls lined with stone and old brick. I could see old wine racks and stacks of crates. But what caught my attention was a large wooden box in the center of the room. It was partially open, the lid tilted at an angle as if it had been hastily closed. I approached the box, my heart racing, and lifted the lid. Inside, I found old newspapers and photographs, all of them yellowed with age. The newspapers were from decades ago, their headlines faded but still legible. They spoke of a series of strange incidents in the town, disappearances, unexplained fires, and whispers of occult practices. The photographs were even more unsettling. They depicted groups of people gathered in the cellar, their faces obscured by masks and hoods. There were symbols etched into the stone walls, strange shapes that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. The more I looked, the more I felt a growing sense of dread, like I had stumbled upon something that was never meant to be found. As I sifted through the photographs, I heard a noise behind me, a faint shuffling like something moving in the shadows. I turned my flashlight, sweeping across the cellar, but there was nothing there. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the walls were closing in. I knew I had to leave to get out of the cellar before whatever was lurking in the darkness found me. I climbed the staircase, each step feeling like a struggle against some unseen force. The cellar door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing through the empty hallway. I found the owner waiting at the top of the stairs, his polite smile gone, replaced by a look of grim resignation. "So, do you still want the house?" he asked, his voice low and strained. I shook my head, handing back the key, and left without saying another word. As I walked back down the street, I couldn't shake the feeling that the cellar held more secrets than behind uncovered. The photographs, the symbols, the old newspapers, they were all pieces of a dark puzzle, one that I had no intention of solving. The small town, with its charming houses and friendly neighbors, suddenly felt cold and unwelcoming. I knew that I would never return to that house, and that whatever darkness lay hidden in the cellar would remain a mystery I was content to leave behind. Story 18. Late-night trains have a unique atmosphere. The rhythmic clatter of wheels, pull on tracks, the dimly lit compartments, and the gentle swaying as the landscape passes by in the darkness. I was on one of these trains, a long-haul journey across the country, the kind where you settle into a compartment and let the world outside blur into the night. It was past midnight, and most of the passengers were asleep, their silhouettes faint against the soft glow of reading lamps. I was in the upper observation car, enjoying the quiet and the view, when I noticed a strange smell. It was subtle at first, like something burning, but it grew stronger, becoming accurate and unpleasant. I thought it might be coming from the snack bar, perhaps something left in the oven too long. But as I walked through the train, the smell persisted, growing more intense as I approached the luggage apartment. It was a heavy, cloying scent that made my eyes water and my throat itch. I checked with the conductor, who was taking tickets a few cars back, but he shrugged it off. "Probably just a mechanical issue," he said, barely looking up from his clipboard. "We get those sometimes. If it gets worse, let me know." His nonchalance didn't sit well with me, but I decided to return to my compartment and try to sleep. I figured it was just one of those quirks of train travel, a small inconvenience that would be fixed at the next stop. But the smell lingered, filling the air with a sense of foreboding. About an hour later, the train slowed, coming to a halt at a small station in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't on the schedule, and there were no signs of a town or other passengers waiting on the platform. The sudden stop was jarring, waking those who had been asleep. People peered out of windows, confused and curious, murmuring questions among themselves. Then I saw the police lights flashing blue and red, casting eerie patterns on the walls of the train. Officers in dark uniforms boarded the cars, their expressions stern and focused. They moved through the train, searching each compartment, asking passengers to remain seated and keep their hands visible. The atmosphere shifted from curiosity to tension, the air growing thick with unease. I heard the murmur of questions, people wondering what was happening, but the police offered no explanations. They moved with precision, their eyes scanning the passengers, checking bags and luggage racks. When they reached my compartment, the officer asked if I had noticed anything unusual. I mentioned the strange smell from the luggage compartment, and his eyes narrowed. He nodded to another officer who left to check it out. I felt a surge of anxiety, realizing that something serious might be happening, something far beyond a simple mechanical issue. As the officers continued their search, the train's conductor tried to calm the passengers, assuring them that everything was under control. But his voice lacked conviction, and the tension in the air was palpable. People whispered among themselves, wondering if there had been an accident or if there was some kind of threat on the train. The police continued their search for what felt like an eternity, each moment stretching with uncertainty. When the officer who checked the luggage compartment returned, he was carrying a small bag, carefully sealed and handled with gloves. He whispered to his colleagues, and they quickly left the train, their footsteps heavy on the platform. The conductor announced that the train would resume its journey shortly, but the mood had changed. Passengers were uneasy, their eyes darting around as if expecting more police to appear. I sat in my compartment, my thoughts racing with possibilities. What was in the bag? Why had the train stopped at this remote station? And why had the police left without giving any explanations? The train eventually started moving again, the clatter of the tracks filling the silence. But the journey had taken on a different tone, one of caution and uncertainty. The other passengers kept to themselves, their whispers subdued as if they feared drawing attention. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something, dangerous something hidden within the train's compartments. The smell, the police, the mysterious bag. It all felt like the beginning of a story that I didn't want to know the ending of. I kept my eyes on the passing landscape, the darkness outside a reminder that some secrets are best left undiscovered. Story 19: Cleaning crime scenes isn't for the faint of heart. It requires a strong stomach and an even stronger sense of detachment. Over the years, I'd seen my share of grim scenes, each one more haunting than the last. But nothing prepared me for the remote cabin in the woods. The crime was as gruesome as it was mysterious. The cabin was isolated, hidden deep in a forest, where the trees loomed tall and the underbrush was thick. The drive there was long, the dirt roads barely navigable, and the remoteness only added to the sense of dread. When I arrived, the local sheriff met me at the entrance, his face pale and drawn. He didn't say much, just handed me a pair of gloves and a flashlight, then led me inside. The scene was brutal. Bloodstains covered the floor, splattered across the furniture and up the walls. The smell of decay hung heavy in the air, mingling with the scent of burnt wood from a long dead fire. I had seen violent crime scenes before, but this one felt different, more deliberate, more ritualistic. I started my work cleaning and sanitizing, trying to focus on the task at hand. But as I moved through the cabin, I noticed something that made me pause. There were symbols carved into the walls, intricate patterns that stretched from floor to ceiling. They were etched deep into the wood, each line precise and deliberate, forming a complex design that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. Recognize the symbols, their twisted shapes and jagged edges. I'd seen them before at another crime scene miles away, in a rundown motel on the edge of town. That case had been equally disturbing a violent attack with no clear motive. And the symbols had been carved into the walls there too. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it, just another grim detail in a gruesome scene. But now, seeing the same symbols in this remote cabin, I knew it couldn't be a coincidence. I asked the sheriff about the symbols, but he dismissed them as just some crazed ramblings. He seemed more focused on the physical evidence, the obvious signs of struggle and the horrific aftermath. But I couldn't let it go. The symbols were too deliberate, too precise, and they felt like a message of warning from someone or something with a darker purpose. As I continued cleaning, I took pictures of the symbols, capturing their intricate designs and the way they seemed to flow across the walls. I wasn't sure what they meant, but I knew they were important, a connection between two crime scenes that couldn't be ignored. The rest of the cleanup was uneventful, though. The sense of unease lingered. The cabin felt oppressive, as if the walls themselves were watching me, the carved symbols taking on a life of their own. I finished my work and left the sheriff thanking me for my efforts and assuring me they'd investigate further. But the symbols haunted me. I couldn't stop thinking about their meaning, about what they might represent. I showed the photos to a friend who was a researcher in ancient symbols and occult practices, hoping he might have some insight. He was intrigued but puzzled, saying he'd never seen anything quite like them before. I knew I had stumbled upon something larger than just a crime scene cleanup. The symbols, the connection between the two locations, and the ritualistic feel of the crime, all of it pointed to a deeper mystery, one that I felt compelled to uncover. I started researching similar cases, looking for patterns, for anything that might tie them together. The more I dug, the more I realized that these weren't isolated incidents. There were reports of similar symbols appearing at crime scenes across the state, each one with a level of violence that suggested a ritualistic motive. It was as if someone or some group was sending a message, one that only a few could understand. I knew I had to be careful to watch my back, because the symbols felt like a warning. The remote cabin in the woods was just the beginning, the first piece of a puzzle that would lead me down a dark and dangerous path. But I was determined to find out what it all meant, to uncover the truth behind the patterns and the crimes they accompany. Story 20. The small coastal town was the kind of place where everyone seemed to know each other, where the scent of salt water mixed with the aroma of fried seafood from the local shacks. I was there for a weekend getaway, hoping to enjoy the beach and the peaceful ambience. It was a quiet evening, the sun setting over the horizon, casting a warm glow across the docks. That's when I met the old fisherman, a grizzled man with weathered skin and a beard that looked like seaweed. He was sitting on a bench by the pier, mending a fishing net and humming an old sea shanty. we struck up a conversation talking about the best spots to fish and the history of the town. His stories were vivid, filled with tales of storms and daring rescues. But one story stood out, a shipwreck from decades ago that had become the stuff of local legend. According to the fisherman, the ship was a trading vessel carrying a fortune in valuables from distant lands. A sudden storm had struck, and the ship had run aground on the rocks just offshore. The crew managed to escape, but the captain had stayed behind, determined to hide a chest filled with treasures somewhere in the town. The storm eventually took the ship, dragging it to the bottom of the sea, and the chest was never found. I was intrigued, asking the fisherman if he knew where the captain might have hidden the chest. He leaned in, lowering his voice, and said he believed it was somewhere in the old lighthouse at the edge of town. The lighthouse had been abandoned. For years, its light long extinguished, but locals still whispered about strange lights seen in its windows at night. I asked the fisherman if he could take me to the lighthouse, but he shook his head, a hint of fear in his eyes. "It's not a place to go after dark," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "Strange things happen there. People who go in don't always come out." I wanted to know more, to ask him what he meant by strange things. But before I could, a group of tourists approached, and the fisherman turned his attention to them. I thanked him for the story and headed back to my hotel, planning to visit the lighthouse the next day. The following morning, I returned to the pier to look for the fisherman, hoping to get more details about the shipwreck and the hidden chest, but he was nowhere to be found. I asked around, describing him to the locals, but nobody seemed to know who I was talking about. It was as if he'd vanished without a trace, his presence erased from the town's memory. I was puzzled, wondering if the fisherman had been a figment of my imagination, a ghostly figure conjured by the sea. But I couldn't shake the feeling that his story was true, that the shipwreck and the hidden chest were more than just local legend. I decided to visit the lighthouse to see for myself if there was any truth to his words. The lighthouse stood on a rocky outcrop, its once white walls now gray and weathered. The path leading to it was overgrown, and the wind whipped through tall grass as I made my way to the entrance. The door was ajar, the hinges rusted, and a sense of foreboding hung in the air. Inside the lighthouse was dark and decrepit. The stairs creaked as I climbed each step, echoing in the empty tower. As I reached the top, I found the old lantern room, its glass panes cracked and covered in grime. But what caught my attention was a small alcove in the wall, partially hidden by a pile of debris. I cleared away the rubble and found an old chest, its wood splintered and rotting, but still intact. My heart raced as I opened it, revealing a collection of old coins, jewelry, and other trinkets. It was the hidden chest the fisherman had mentioned, the one the captain had buried in the town decades ago. But as I stood there, examining the contents, I heard a faint whisper in the wind, a voice that seemed to come from the sea. It was the fisherman's voice, his words haunting and cryptic. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice carrying on the breeze. "Some secrets are best left buried." I knew I had uncovered something valuable, but the fisherman's warning lingered in my mind. The lighthouse, the shipwreck, the hidden chest. They were all part of a story that had taken a dark turn. I left the lighthouse, the wind howling as I descended the stairs, and returned to the town with the chest in hand. But I knew I would never forget the old fisherman, his mysterious disappearance, and the secrets he had left behind. Story 21, volunteering at an animal shelter, was one of the highlights of my week. The wagging tails, the playful purrs, and the sheer joy that the animals brought to everyone around them made the hard work worthwhile. The shelter was always bustling, during the day filled with people adopting pets and volunteers caring for the animals. But at night it was a different story. The lights were dimmed and the shelter became eerily quiet, the cages empty except for the occasional rustling of bedding. One night I stayed late to help with an event cleaning up after a busy day. As I walked through the shelter, double-checking that all the cages were locked and the animals settled, I noticed something odd. Several cages in the back section had been left open, their doors swinging gently. At first, I thought someone had forgotten to lock them, but then I realized that the animals inside were missing. I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't like the animals to wander off, especially not from the back section where the more anxious and less social ones were kept. I called out, hoping to hear the familiar sounds of barking or meowing. Though the shelter was silent, I checked with the night staff, asking if they'd seen anyone or noticed anything unusual. They shrugged, suggesting that maybe the animals had slipped out when the staff went home. But the explanation didn't sit well with me. These animals weren't the type to roam. They were scared, often recovering from trauma. Something was wrong, and I had to find out what. I decided to review the security footage, hoping to catch a glimpse of what had happened during the night. The shelter had cameras positioned throughout, including the back section where the cages were now empty. As I watched the footage, the timestamps moving slowly through the night, I saw the shelter's familiar shapes and shadows. But then, just past midnight, a dark figure appeared on the screen. At first, it was just a blur, a shadow, that seemed to drift between the cages. But as I watched, I realized that its movements were unnatural, almost fluid, like it was gliding rather than walking. The shape was indistinct, lacking clear edges or definition, but it was unmistakably inhuman. It moved from cage to cage, each time pausing for a moment, and then the cage door would open, the animal inside disappearing into the darkness. I felt a surge of fear, my heart racing as I watched the footage. This wasn't a typical break-in, and it wasn't a prank. The figure's movements were deliberate, each action smooth and controlled, as if it knew exactly what it was doing. It opened the cages with ease, its dark form slipping through the shadows without making a sound. I called the shelter's manager, waking him in the middle of the night, and explained what I had seen. He was skeptical at first, suggesting that maybe the footage was distorted, or there was a technical glitch. But when he arrived and watched the footage, he couldn't deny what he saw. The dark figure, the open cages, the missing animals. It was all too real. The manager called the police, and they arrived shortly after their presence, bringing a sense of urgency to the shelter. They took statements, asked questions, and reviewed the security footage. But even they seemed puzzled by what they saw. The inhuman shape and its eerie movements, defying explanation. The police launched an investigation, searching the surrounding area for any sign of the missing animals or the dark figure from the footage. But they found nothing. No footprints. No signs of forced entry. Just the empty cages and the unsettling footage. It was as if the dark figure had vanished into thin air, leaving no trace behind. The shelter's atmosphere changed after that night. The staff were on edge, and the remaining animals seemed restless, as if they sensed the danger. The security was tightened, but the fear lingered, the memory of the dark figures casting a shadow over the shelter. I continued to volunteer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something unnatural had entered our world. The open cages, the missing animals, and the inhuman movements on the security footage were a mystery that might never be solved. But I knew one thing for sure. The dark figure was out there somewhere, and it wasn't finished with its sinister work. Story 22, The Highway. Stretched for miles, a lonely ribbon of asphalt cutting through barren landscapes. It was the kind of road where you could drive for hours without seeing another soul. The desert stretching out on either side like an endless wasteland. I was on my way to a business meeting in another state, but I'd taken this detour to avoid traffic and get some quiet time on the open road. The day was fading into dusk, the sky turning shades of orange and pink, when I passed by an old, abandoned gas station. It was a relic from another era, its rusty signs swaying in the breeze, paint peeling off its walls. Something about it caught my eye, a sense of nostalgia, maybe, or just curiosity about what had happened to the place. I slowed down and pulled over my tires, crunching on the gravel. The gas station looked like it hadn't been used in years, the windows boarded up and the pumps covered in dust and cobwebs. But as I got out of my car, I felt a strange pull, like something was drawing me inside. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the hinges groaning with age. The interior was dark, the faint light from the setting sun casting long shadows across the floor. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. The walls were lined with old shelves, some of them collapsed under the weight of years of neglect. The air was musty, filled with the scent of decay and forgotten memories. As I walked through the gas station, I noticed a pile of newspapers on the floor tucked into a corner near the back. They looked out of place, not like the rest of the decaying debris. I picked one up, brushing off the dust, and my eyes widened when I saw the data was from just a few days ago. The headline read, "Person missing in this area." I grabbed another newspaper, then another, each one with the same headline, each one detailing a different disappearance. The stories were all similar. People who had been traveling through the area, who had stopped for gas or to rest, and who had vanished without a trace. The articles mentioned search parties and police investigations, but no leads, no clues as to what had happened to them. A chill ran down my spine as I flipped through the newspapers, each one filled with stories of missing people. I wondered why they were here in this abandoned gas station, far from the nearest town. It felt like a warning, a message for those who ventured into this desolate stretch of highway. I decided to leave the sense of unease growing with each passing moment. But as I turned to go, I heard a noise from the back of the gas station, a faint shuffling like someone or something was moving in the darkness. I froze, my heart racing, my instincts telling me to run. The shuffling grew louder, more deliberate, like someone was approaching. I backed away, my steps cautious, my eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. But the gas station was silent again, the only sound my own breathing, heavy and uneven. I knew I couldn't stay, not after what I'd found, not with the headlines repeating in my mind, person missing in this area. I left the gas station, the door slamming shut behind me, the echo reverberating through the empty highway. The sky was darker now, the sun a distant memory, and the landscape seemed even more desolate. I got into my car and drove my headlights, cutting through the darkness, the road stretching out before me like a lifeline. The rest of the drive was filled with a sense of urgency, the memory of the abandoned gas station and its ominous newspapers haunting me. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see someone or something following me down the highway. But there was nothing, just the empty road and the distant howl of the wind. When I reached the next town, I stopped at a small diner and called the local authorities, reporting what I had found. The dispatcher seemed concerned but not surprised, as if the disappearances were becoming a common occurrence. I knew I had done the right thing, but the fear lingered, the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something dark and dangerous. I never took that stretch of highway again, and I avoided driving at night whenever I could. The abandoned gas station, the newspapers, whip their chilling headline. It was all too much to forget. The desolate roads held their secrets, and I knew I was lucky to have escaped without becoming another story in the headlines. Story 23, house sitting for a wealthy family, seemed like an easy gig. It was a grand estate, the kind with a long driveway and manicured lawns. The owners were out of town for a few weeks, and my job was to water the plants, feed the pets, and make sure the place didn't fall into disarray. I had the run of the house, which included the study, a cozy room with dark wood paneling, leather-bound books, and a massive mahogany desk. The study was my favorite spot. It had an air of mystery filled with old artifacts and curiosities. But there was one thing that always caught my eye. Drawer in the desk locked tight with a heavy padlock. The rest of the desk was accessible, but that drawer was off limits. Naturally, my curiosity was piqued one evening after a day of watching movies and lounging by the pool. I decided to explore the study more thoroughly. The locked drawer was an itch I couldn't scratch, a puzzle begging to be solved. I found a set of keys in the master bedroom, tucked away in a jewelry box, and one of them fit the padlock perfectly. The lock clicked open, and I slid the drawer out, expecting to find valuables or family heirlooms. Instead, there was a stack of VHS tapes, each one labeled with a name and a date. The names were familiar. They belonged to the family members who owned the house, but the dates ranged from years ago to the present day. What disturbed me most was the most recent tape. It was still recording. I felt a chill run down my spine as I picked up the tapes, examining the labels. There was a tape for each family member, from the father and mother to the teenage son and daughter. The dates on the labels suggested they were recorded over a period of years, documenting moments from the family's life. But why would the most recent tapes still be recording? And why would it be locked away in a drawer? I took the tapes to the living room, where an old VHS player was connected to a large television. I hesitated, wondering if I should really be watching these tapes, but my curiosity got the better of me. I loaded the first tape, one labeled with the father's name, and pressed play. The screen flickered to life, showing a static-filled image. Slowly, it resolved into a scene of the study, the same room where I had found the tapes. The father was sitting at the desk, typing on a laptop, seemingly unaware that he was being recorded. The angle suggested the camera was hidden, positioned somewhere in the study where it couldn't be seen. I watched as the father worked, answering phone calls and flipping through paperwork. It was mundane at first, but then he stopped, his expression changing to one of fear. He looked around as if sensing something in the room, but there was nothing there. The tape ended abruptly, leaving me with more questions than answers. I loaded the next tape, this one labeled with the mother's name. It showed her in the kitchen preparing dinner. But again, there was a sense of unease. She glanced over her shoulder repeatedly, as if expecting someone to appear. The same pattern emerged. Normal activities followed by sudden moments of fear or suspicion. I continued through the tapes, each one showing a different family member in their own setting. The son playing video games, the daughter talking on her phone. But each time there was a moment of tension, a sense that they were being watched. The final tape, the one still recording, showed an empty room with only the sound of distant voices in the background. I knew I had stumbled upon something sinister, something that suggested the family was under surveillance, but I didn't know why. By the tapes, the hidden cameras, the locked drawer. It all pointed to a secret that the family didn't want anyone to know. But who was recording these tapes, and why were they hidden away, out of sight? I decided to call the family to tell them what I'd found, but there was no answer. Their phones went straight to voicemail, as if they were out of range, or intentionally ignoring calls. The sense of isolation grew, the mansion feeling less like a home and more like a fortress, each room hiding its own secrets. I knew I had to leave to get out of the house before whatever was happening reached me. I packed my things, grabbing the tapes, and headed for the front door. But as I reached for the handle, I heard a faint noise from the study, the sound of someone moving through the room. I turned, my heart racing, but the house was silent, the only sound my own rapid breathing. I left the mansion, the tapes clutched tightly in my hands, the fear following me down the driveway. I knew I had uncovered something dangerous, something that threatened not just the family, but anyone who got too close.